The water shimmered like liquid diamonds under the Mediterranean sun, but Richard Whitmore wasn't admiring the view. His hands trembled as he gripped his phone, watching the security footage from his hidden cameras with growing horror. What he was seeing couldn't be real. It simply couldn't be. 3 months earlier, Richard had been a different man, confident, successful, perhaps a bit too proud of the empire he'd built from nothing. The tech company he'd founded at 23 had made him a millionaire by 30, and now at 42, he had everything money could buy. A sprawling estate in the Hollywood Hills, luxury cars, and investments that generated more passive income than most people earned in a lifetime. But none of it mattered anymore. Not since the accident that had taken his wife, Catherine. The drunk driver who crossed the median on Pacific Coast Highway hadn't just killed the love of Richard's life. He'd shattered their 7-year-old son's world too. Little Marcus hadn't spoken a word in the 6 months since his mother's funeral. The specialists called it selective mutism, trauma-induced. They said he needed time, therapy, patience. Richard had provided all three, along with the best child psychologists money could buy, but his son remained locked in a prison of silence. Work had become impossible. Richard couldn't focus on quarterly reports when his son sat in the playroom for hours, staring at nothing, clutching the stuffed elephant his mother had given him on his 5th birthday. So Richard had done what powerful men do when they feel powerless. He'd tried to control what he could. He'd hired staff, the best money could buy, a chef trained in Paris, a tutor from an elite academy, security personnel with military backgrounds. And Maria Santos, the maid. She'd come through an exclusive agency with impeccable references. 48 years old, originally from the Philippines, she'd worked for diplomats and celebrities across California. She was quiet, efficient, and kept to herself. Exactly what Richard wanted. Someone who would clean, maintain the household, and not try to offer unwanted sympathy or advice about his son. But Richard was a man who'd built his fortune on information, on knowing what others didn't. Trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. So he'd had cameras installed throughout the property, hidden in smoke detectors, wall outlets, even in decorative objects. 19 cameras in total, covering every room except the bathrooms and bedrooms. He told himself it was about security, about protecting his vulnerable son from a world that had already hurt them too much. For the first 2 months, the footage was exactly what he expected. Maria arrived at 6 in the morning, cleaned methodically, prepared meals according to the chef's instructions when he was off duty, and left at 6 in the evening. She barely interacted with Marcus, who spent most of his time with the tutor or the therapist, or alone in his playroom. Richard would watch the recordings each night, fast-forwarding through hours of mundane domestic routine, finding nothing unusual. Then came the day that changed everything. Richard had been in San Francisco for an unavoidable board meeting. He'd left Marcus in the care of his staff, with strict instructions to call if anything went wrong. The meeting had run long, and by the time Richard checked his phone, it was past 8 in the evening. He'd missed several notifications from his home security system, flagging unusual activity by the pool. His heart had lurched. The pool. Catherine had drowned in their pool after the accident, a seizure the doctors said, a delayed effect of her head trauma. They'd found her floating face down on a Tuesday morning. Richard had filled the pool with concrete. The next week, or so he'd planned, but the contractor said it would take months to do it properly. Instead, he'd had it drained completely and locked the gate with a code only he knew. Or so he thought. Now, sitting in his hotel room, Richard opened the security app with shaking hands. He scrolled to the pool camera and selected the afternoon footage. What he saw made his blood run cold. The pool gate was open. Someone had filled the pool. Not completely, but enough. Maybe 2 feet of water. And there, in that water, was his son. Marcus was in the pool. His silent, traumatized son who hadn't left his room voluntarily in weeks. But he wasn't alone. Maria was with him, and she was in the water too, still fully dressed in her uniform. And she was talking to him, her lips moving rapidly, her hands gesturing. Richard's first instinct was rage. She'd opened the locked gate, filled the forbidden pool, taken his son to the exact place where his mother had died. He was reaching for his phone to call the police when he noticed something that made him pause. Marcus was looking at Maria. Really looking at her, his eyes focused and present in a way Richard hadn't seen since before the accident. And then, As Richard watched in disbelief, his son's mouth opened. He couldn't hear what Marcus was saying through the silent footage, but he was clearly speaking. Words were forming. His son was talking. Richard watched the entire hour-long recording in stunned silence. He watched Maria and Marcus in the water, watched her show him something in her hands, a toy boat, it looked like. He watched his son's face transform from blank emptiness to something like curiosity, then concentration, then what might have been the ghost of a smile. He watched Maria put her arm around Marcus's shoulders, and he watched his son lean into the embrace instead of pulling away as he did with everyone else. Richard didn't sleep that night. He returned home at dawn, exhausted and confused, his mind spinning with questions and emotions he couldn't name. He'd planned to confront Maria immediately, to demand answers, perhaps to fire her despite what he'd seen. But when he entered the house, he found Marcus sitting at the breakfast table, eating, actually eating, while Maria prepared orange juice in the kitchen. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," Maria said quietly, her voice betraying no awareness that anything unusual had happened. "I hope your trip went well. There's fresh coffee in the pot." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. Marcus was looking at him with those big, haunted eyes that looked so much like Catherine's. His son wasn't speaking. The silence had returned, but something in his posture seemed different. Less rigid, less absent. "Maria," Richard said carefully, "could I speak with you in my study after breakfast?" She nodded once, her face unreadable. Richard spent the next 20 minutes pushing food around his plate, unable to eat, watching his son and his maid in a new light. What had he missed? What had been happening in his house while he obsessed over security footage and business reports? When Maria finally entered his study, she closed the door behind her and stood with her hands folded, waiting. She had the patient stillness of someone who'd spent a lifetime in service, but Richard thought he detected something else now. A quiet defiance, perhaps, or simply the dignity of someone who knew her own worth. "The pool," Richard said, dispensing with pleasantries. "You opened the gate. You filled it. You took my son there." "Yes, sir. That gate was locked for a reason. My wife died in that pool." "I know, sir. Marcus told me." Richard felt the room tilt slightly. "He told you. When?" "He doesn't speak. He hasn't spoken in 6 months." Maria's expression softened, slightly. "He speaks to me, Mr. Whitmore. Has been speaking to me for 5 weeks now." 5 weeks. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the chest. His son had been talking for 5 weeks, and he hadn't known. Hadn't noticed. What kind of father was he? "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Because he wasn't ready for you to know yet." Maria's voice remained gentle but firm. "And because I thought you might stop me from helping him." "Helping him? You took him to the place where his mother died." "Yes, because that's where he needed to go." Richard stood abruptly, anger and confusion warring inside him. "You had no right. You're the maid. You clean the house. You don't make decisions about my son's therapy." "You're right," Maria said simply. "I clean your house, but I also see your son every day. I see how he sits in that playroom, holding his mother's elephant, staring at the photos of her that you've put everywhere, like a shrine. I see how he walks past the pool every day, looking at the locked gate like it's a prison door. And I see how no one, not the therapists, not the tutors, not even you, has helped him understand that he's allowed to live even though she died." The words hit Richard like physical blows. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the truth he heard in her words. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that his son had spoken to this woman and not to him. "Sit down," he said quietly. "Please, tell me everything." Maria sat in the chair opposite his desk, her weathered hands still folded in her lap. When she began to speak, her voice carried the weight of a story she'd been holding for a long time. "I had a daughter," she said. "Her name was Isabel. She was 8 years old when she drowned in a swimming pool at a birthday party. I wasn't there. I was working, cleaning another rich family's house, earning money to give her a better life." Her voice remained steady, but Richard saw her knuckles whiten slightly. "After she died, I couldn't look at water. Not pools, not the ocean, not even a full bathtub. For 3 years, I lived like that. Afraid, angry, convinced that if I avoided water, I could somehow avoid the pain. Richard found himself leaning forward, his anger forgotten. But pain doesn't work that way, Maria continued. It doesn't disappear because we lock it away. It just grows, like a tumor, until it's all we are. One day, my sister took me to the beach. She forced me to walk into the water. I screamed at her. I cried. I told her I hated her. But she held my hand and walked me in anyway. And when the water reached my waist, when I finally faced what I'd been running from, something broke open inside me. The pain didn't go away, but it changed. It became something I could carry instead of something that carried me. So you took Marcus to the pool, Richard said softly, beginning to understand. I saw myself in him, Mr. Whitmore. The same fear, the same way of locking the world out. But he's 7 years old. He has his whole life ahead of him. I couldn't watch him build a prison around his heart the way I did. She paused, meeting Richard's eyes directly. That first day, 6 weeks ago, I found him standing at the pool gate. He was touching the lock, crying silently. And I asked him if he wanted to go in. He nodded. 6 weeks ago, Richard repeated. You've been doing this for 6 weeks. Every day. At first, we just sat by the edge. He told me about his mother, about how she taught him to swim, about the games they played in the water. He talked and talked, like a dam breaking. Then one day, he asked if we could put water in the pool. Just a little, just enough to remember. Richard felt tears burning in his eyes. I didn't know. God, I didn't know he needed. I thought keeping him away from it would protect him. You're his father. You love him. You were protecting yourself too, which is understandable. But sometimes, Mr. Whitmore, the only way forward is through the thing that hurt us most. Richard watched the rest of the recordings that day, all of them, from the beginning. He saw his son slowly come back to life in those stolen hours by the pool. He saw Marcus laugh for the first time in 6 months, when Maria splashed water at him accidentally. He saw his boy build elaborate stories with toy boats and action figures, acting out adventures his mother might have enjoyed. He saw Maria listen with infinite patience, never pushing, just present in a way that Richard realized he hadn't been. The truth cut deep. He'd been so consumed by his own grief, so focused on controlling the external variables of their life, that he'd missed what his son actually needed. Not expensive therapists or top tutors or elaborate security systems. Just someone who saw him. Someone who understood that healing wasn't about avoiding pain but about learning to live with it. That evening, Richard did something he hadn't done in months. He went to his son's room after dinner and sat on the edge of the bed. Marcus looked at him with those careful, watchful eyes. Maria told me you've been talking, Richard said softly. She told me about the pool. Marcus's body tensed, preparing for punishment or anger. Instead, Richard held out his hand. Would you show me? Would you take me to the pool and tell me about Mom? For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. Then, slowly, he placed his small hand in his father's larger one. Together, they walked through the quiet house, past the security cameras Richard had installed to keep his son safe, past the locked doors and controlled environments, out to the pool where Catherine had died and where Marcus was learning to live again. Maria had already filled the pool to their usual depth. The water glowed in the evening light. Father and son stood at the edge, and Richard felt his throat close with emotion. She used to do this thing, Marcus said, his voice rusty from disuse but clear. The first words Richard had heard from his son in half a year. She'd pretend to be a dolphin. She'd make the noise and everything. It was so silly. Richard laughed, a sound that was half sob. I remember. She did it on our honeymoon too. I was so embarrassed. She made everything fun, Marcus whispered. Even boring stuff. She did. I miss her so much, Dad. Me too, buddy. Me too. They stood there together as the sun set, and Richard felt something shift in his chest. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but it no longer felt like a wall between him and his son. It felt like something they could share, something that connected them to Catherine and to each other. Over the following weeks, Richard began to truly see his home and his son for the first time since the accident. He cut back on work, spending afternoons by the pool with Marcus. He listened when his son talked about his mother, sharing his own stories in return. He watched Maria move through the house with new appreciation, understanding that she wasn't just a maid but a person who'd suffered her own losses and found the strength to help a child navigate his. One evening, 2 months after Richard had first seen that security footage, he found Maria preparing to leave for the day. He stopped her with a hand on her arm. "I never thanked you properly," he said. "For saving my son. For seeing what he needed when I was too blind to see it myself." Maria smiled, a warm expression that transformed her usually composed face. "You're not blind, Mr. Whitmore. You were just hurt. Hurt. People sometimes can't see past their own pain. There's no shame in that. Maybe not, but there's shame in not recognizing when someone has given you a gift beyond price." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking. Marcus starts 2nd grade in the fall. He's going to need someone who understands him, who he trusts. I know this isn't traditionally in your job description, but would you consider being more involved in his daily care? Not as a maid, as whatever role you want. A nanny, a companion, a family member. Whatever feels right to you." Maria's eyes glistened. "I would be honored, Mr. Whitmore." "Richard," he corrected gently. "Please. Anyone who loves my son the way you do shouldn't have to call me Mr. Whitmore." That night, after Marcus was asleep, Richard sat in his study and systematically went through his security system. He disabled the indoor cameras, all 19 of them. He'd installed them thinking that information and control would keep his son safe, but he understood now that real safety didn't come from surveillance. It came from trust, from connection, from being present even when being present hurt. He kept the outdoor security cameras for actual security purposes, but the ones inside, the ones that had shown him the truth but also represented his inability to simply be with his son without the buffer of technology, those he dismantled personally. The pool became a place of healing for all of them. Richard had it properly refilled, and they used it almost every evening. Marcus taught him the games Catherine had invented, and they created new ones too. Sometimes Maria joined them, sharing stories of her daughter, keeping Isabel's memory alive the way they kept Catherine's alive, not as a source of pain but as a celebration of love that continued even after death. Richard eventually discovered that Maria sent most of her salary back to the Philippines to support her extended family and fund a swimming safety program for children in her home village. He quietly established a foundation in Isabel's name, fully funded, to expand the program. Maria cried when he told her, but they were tears of gratitude and healing. As Marcus's 2nd grade year began, he walked into school holding his father's hand, chattering about his teacher and his classmates and the project he wanted to do about dolphins because his mom had loved them. He was still a quiet child, still carried his grief with him, but he'd learned that he could carry joy too. That one didn't cancel out the other. Richard learned to be a different kind of father, less focused on control and more focused on connection. His business suffered a bit as he delegated more and worked less, but he found he didn't care. The numbers in his bank account had never made him happy anyway. What made him happy was his son's laughter echoing across the pool, or Marcus's small hand in his during the goodnight ritual they'd established, or the peace on Maria's face when she watched them together. The security footage that had almost made Richard collapse that day in San Francisco had shown him something he hadn't been looking for. Not danger or betrayal, but love in action. It had shown him that healing doesn't come from hiding from our wounds but from having the courage to face them, preferably with people who understand pain and choose compassion anyway. On the 1st anniversary of Catherine's death, the 3 of them, Richard, Marcus, and Maria, released floating lanterns on the pool at sunset. Each lantern carried a message, a memory, a piece of love that death couldn't diminish. As they watched the lights drift across the water, Marcus leaned against his father on one side and Maria on the other, and Richard felt Catherine's presence not as an absence but as the foundation on which they'd built this new, scarred, beautiful version of their family. "She'd be proud of us," Marcus said quietly. "She would," Richard agreed, his arm around his son. "She really would." And somewhere in his heart, past the grief and the regret and the fear, Richard knew it was true. They hadn't moved on from Catherine. They never would, but they'd learned to move forward with her memory as a light instead of a chain. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest gift we can give to those we've lost is to truly live, to let their love change us for the better rather than letting loss define us. The cameras were gone, but Richard could see more clearly than ever before. And what he saw, finally, was enough.